What I noticed was that this thing could cantilever at 25-degree angle, and this is when I was seeing this ionic blue flame coming from the nether region of the craft.
And then Prince Philip, I did send books to Prince Philip, and he thanked me for them.
So here is somebody who could lift up the phone and say, look here, what's going on in the United States. I've followed the story with interest about the NASA report, the reports from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the congressional hearings, the multiple UFO-related provisions in the defense bill. I want a full classified briefing, and I'm sure he would get one.
And I think Charles saved all of our lives that night.
You had a huge library of books and magazines, and actually one time it was revealed that the Queen and Prince Philip took a crop circle book. I think it was one of Colin Andrews' books on as for their summer holidays.
We were talking about it, and he said, "John, are you religious?" I said, "Well, I'm a Christian." He said, "No, that's not what I meant." He said, "Do you take, are you Catholic, or do you go to church, and etc." I said, "Well, not really." And so he said, "Well, I admire you for what you're doing." He said, "But," he said, "don't bother." He said, "Because this is demonic. This is what this is all about, demonic. UFOs are demonic."
This film looks into the British royal family's interest in UFOs and questions whether King Charles III could help start the disclosure process in the UK. We also look at the incredible story of the Canadian diver Dan Costello, who claims to have worked in 1975 on a top secret man-made UFO project with the then Prince Charles. I just wanted to pick your brains really on the royal family's interest in UFOs and the unexplained. Do you know how far that goes back to?
Well, first of all, I suppose I should quickly start at the beginning. My ex-father-in-law, Ted West, Chief Petty Officer Ted West, he served aboard HMS Kelly, and Lord Louis Mountbatten was his captain. And according to Ted, when the ship was sunk off Crete, I think it was 41. I tend to get it mixed up a bit. I think it was 41. Ted, who was he managed to shoot down a Stuka before the ship went down, and after the ship had gone down, he jumped in, and so did Lord Louis Mountbatten, or Captain Mountbatten as he was known. And when they came to the surface, as I say, the two men and others were fortunately still alive and survived other Stukas attacking them, and then, as I say, I met Lord Louis in 1974 at a Kelly reunion, and I know that Prince Charles, as he was then, had also gone to one of those reunions, and then of course there was the famous incident at Mountbatten's estate, wasn't it? With Broadlands, the guy named Briggs, I think. Fred Briggs, and that sparked a lot of interest. So yeah, and then Prince Philip, I did send books to Prince Philip, and he thanked me for them, or his secretary thanked me for them, and said he was pleased that, and obviously the books were okay. And I know that, but people talk about Prince Philip, and there's some of these newspaper cuttings that once again, if you like, denigrate somebody's somebody's intentions or denigrate somebody's interest in a subject that is still denigrated and treated with ridicule to the present day. So on the other hand, we talk about disclosure, but on the one hand over here, it's still treated as it is. And so why shouldn't Prince Philip have been interested? As I understand it, Lord Louis had files on it anyway, and that's through a source who knew Lord Louis Mountbatten that I spoke to many years ago. So why shouldn't he have them? And why shouldn't I don't know if the current king's got an interest, but why shouldn't anybody have an interest in things that are happening in the sky, reported by people, and for which we cannot explain? Years ago, we tried to explain these things away using logic and rationality, but it doesn't work anymore. And as you can see, the majority of the files here in these archives, they're from, well, they're from members of the public, and then from senior pilots. There's one Air Commodore Michael Swinney, right? Because I have millions of things going around my head, so I have to think. But Air Commodore Michael Swinney, what a smashing bloke! Lived in Hampshire, and he had a sighting. I think about 52. He was flying an RAF plane, and he saw this thing and reported on it, and a report went to the MOD. And when Michael tried to get his report back some years later, it was told that it had been destroyed, it was not available. But hey ho, when he eventually got onto the MOD as a senior officer there, or somebody I think was in charge, he found his report. So what is going on there? What are these agencies that lie behind this? Why do they dictate what we're going to see and what we're not going to see? Because again, I've know a number of pilots I've interviewed that have seen things, saucer-shaped objects, or all manner of strange things they've seen in the sky. But as we said before, predominantly triangular UFOs, or objects forming a triangle, i.e. at each point 1, 2, 3 lights with sometimes a light in the middle. I think if you look through the Derbyshire, Staffordshire area in 96, 97, the skies were full of these objects. It's like we sit here now, and one can sort of imagine that slowly coming over the trees that lie approximately a few hundred yards away, over the top of those trees, would be this huge black triangle with a light in the middle and lights at the side, moving majestically over the British landscape with apparent impunity, as if I don't care what man thinks. And that happened a lot in the 95s, but nobody even mentioned disclosure then. So don't know what it means, don't think it's going to do anything, because I think the subject is too big.
But would you think that King Charles knows more than we do?
Well, I doubt it. Why would he? Would you say that would if you discuss this with Richie Sunak, he'd probably look at you as if you were mad, like he'd look at me if I was mad? Because you see, because he's not educated. He bases his opinions, like anybody else, as we all do, on education. And if you've only come across the a few cases, the famous cases, Betty and Barney Hill and the Rendlesham Forest incident and others like that, you'd think, well, give or take, how can we treat these as seriously? Are you sure people haven't been mistaken? Are you sure it wasn't a lighthouse? Are you sure it wasn't the satellite, which is thinking about the satellite? But when you look at all these reports and sightings, it does make you think. And the other thing is, why is the subject not on the school curriculum?
Well, maybe
Why is that not? I think it is in the States.
Well,
but yeah, so all I'm trying to do is educate people. I can't give any answers. but it is, as I think, as Gordon Creighton said, it is one of the greatest phenomena of modern day times. Whether you are a skeptic or not, it is still the greatest phenomena of modern day times. And it is, isn't it?
It is.
Because the bloody things keep coming through. They do, don't they? Yeah, and that's it.
So, in your opinion, who knows the truth about what these things are? Does anyone?
It's a difficult question. It's difficult to answer, rather. But one would presume that, given the amount of finances available to governments and the super intelligence of scientists, one would have thought they'd have come up with some ideas on this. And if they have come up with the ideas, what it is and where it comes from, well, I can tell you one thing: you and I aren't going to know, because it would cause too much disruption. It would actually. So on the one hand, yes, I want to get the messages across. Yes, I like you. I liked Discovery. I'd like us to be all lay our cards on the table, but in reality, it will not happen, because I don't think you can explain it away as. You can't just explain it away just like that, because I can't say you can do that. I mean, when I first started this, I used to I looked at the sightings of saucer-shaped objects, and they talk about flying saucers in the 40s and 50s, then the UFOs, then the UAPs, which always reminds me of UAP, it sounds like something to do with a cow, but UAP, I think it's just another idea, isn't it? Which it's better to say UAPs than flying saucers. But for goodness sake, these things are saucer shaped. They're any damn shape. So something intelligence, I presume, is causing those shapes to change and move about. And then people used to say, well, I saw some figures near these things, which is certainly jumping me back into the archives, and about the copper that I saw in Devon, who was on duty, and they had a lorry driver come in to see him, and this lorry driver had been on the way home and stopped at a lay-by, and he'd seen in a nearby field a saucer-shaped object with what appears to be three small occupants examining the ground. And that takes me back to Hertfordshire, Herefordshire, and I thought to myself, well, that's impossible. They can't have people in them like us because of the speed they move. But this isn't about people like us, is it? No. It's nothing to do with us. It's an energy that is probably able to manipulate itself, or make us see what we expect to see, or what we contrive to see, because it's something it's really beyond our understanding. It's certainly beyond mine. But the amount of times people have seen these things, and sometimes they've left physical traces as well. There's just I've come across thousands. But the integrity and the honesty of those witnesses that I've spoken to is not an issue, because so many people have got a lot to lose.
Well, there's no getting away from the fact that the royal family had, and maybe still has, though it depends on the personalities, a strong interest in UFOs, crop circles, and the unexplained. Now, this goes right back to Earl Mountbatten and Prince Philip. And Prince Philip was introduced really to the subject of UFOs by his uncle Earl Mountbatten, took a strong interest in it, but because of the extreme sensitivities, had to hide his interest to some extent. I mean, you would think, well, the royals don't have to do anything, but yes, they did, and obviously the Queen was the ultimate authority here. And I'm not saying that she didn't have an interest, but with her, obviously, protocol came first, and just the family. And this was something that could have caused some blowback. So it was made clear that this was an interest that had to be pursued really behind closed doors. And that's what happened. Even the Duke of Edinburgh had to basically conduct his research and investigations through the intermediary of one of his royal equerries. But he did cause various witnesses to be brought in and interviewed, had a huge library of books and magazines. And actually one time it was revealed that the Queen and Prince Philip took a crop circle book. I think it was one of Colin Andrews' books on as for their summer holidays on their official reading list, which then gets disclosed as a result of freedom of information. Not every bit of royal information does, but this was an interesting tidbit to be sure.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. I just wonder how much has been passed down to King Charles, whether he's interested at all. Are you aware of any interest?
Well, King Charles III has kept his own counsel on this. Obviously, his interests in things like environmental issues, sustainability, climate, multiculturalism, other religions is well known. So usually, particularly when he was Prince of Wales, he wore his heart on his sleeve, and of course his outspokenness on some of this got him into trouble. So my estimate is that maybe he doesn't have as strong an interest as his father did on this, because I think if he did, we would have heard about it. On the other hand, he was brought up in obviously the tradition of discretion for the most part, and perhaps he's just keeping things very quiet on this one. It remains to be seen. I mean, I think we're still in the early days comparatively of his reign, and clearly at the moment he just wants to be, I think, a safe hand on the tiller. Obviously the royal family has been through a lot of traumas and scandals, and for the time being his policy is clearly to play things quietly, just get on with the job, a sort of early reign where just consolidating things is the watchword. So he's not going to suddenly start making wild statements about UFOs. He's probably not going to make wild statements about anything, but bubbling below the surface, who knows? He's his father's son, and very often, as most people know, fathers pass on interests, children pick up interests and like specialist subjects from their parents. So we'll see. And of course, we look as well at the next generation and indeed the generation after that. There is an immense archive of material somewhere, but as authors like Andrew Loney have found out with the Mountbatten diaries and such like, it's the devil's own business sometimes to winkle this out of the system. So we will have to wait and see. There are many more exemptions that apply to royal archives than, say, ordinary government archives in terms of exemptions to the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah. I did read somewhere, I don't know how true this is, that Prince Charles attended a UFO conference. Are you aware of this at all?
It wouldn't surprise me. There are, of course, the stories that the Queen and Prince Philip one evening slipped into a performance of Warhorse, and with no real fanfare or anything, and suddenly there was a sort of gasps and murmurs as people recognized them and such like. But these things happen. I suspect a lot more people attend UFO conferences incognito than one would suspect. I did once, actually, when I was on the UFO desk. I slipped quietly into a conference and took notes and sent a report back and such like. I think news of that leaked out when we declassified and released some of the files, but lots of people go to UFO conferences, so royals, it wouldn't surprise me.
back in February. Lord Louis Mountbatten. Undoubtedly the first member of the royal family to show an interest in UFOs and unexplained phenomena was Prince Philip's uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten. According to UFO expert Alexander Rojas, Lord Mountbatten was an important and influential ufologist who also had a keen interest in the paranormal. 55. Mountbatten, who is often referred to as Prince Charles's honorary godfather, made an official report about a strange encounter his bricklayer Fred Briggs allegedly had with a flying saucer and an alien creature. Briggs states, the object was shaped like a child's huge humming top toy and halfway between 20 foot or 30 foot in diameter. Its colour was like dull aluminium, rather like a kitchen saucepan. It was shaped like the sketch which I have endeavoured to make, and had portholes all around the middle, rather like a steamer has. The report went on. While I was watching, a column about the thickness of a man descended from the centre of the saucer, and suddenly I noticed on it what appeared to be a man, presumably standing on a small platform on the end. He did not appear to be holding onto anything. He seemed to be dressed in a dark suit of overalls and was wearing a close-fitting hat or helmet. Mountbatten went to investigate as soon as he heard the tale and said that Fred's bike tracks left in the snow confirmed his movements. In a signed statement, Mountbatten said, Mr. Briggs was still dazed when I first saw him and was worried that no one would believe his story. Indeed, he made a point of saying that he had never believed in flying saucers before and had been absolutely amazed at what he had seen. He did not give me the impression of being a sort of man who would be subject to hallucinations or would in any way invent such a crazy story. I'm sure that from the sincere way he gave his account that he himself is completely convinced of the truth of his own statement. This interest in UFOs was passed on by Lord Mountbatten to his nephew, Prince Philip, who, according to a book called The Secret Royals by Richard J. Aldrich and Rory Cormack, the late Prince Philip was a lifelong UFO enthusiast and firmly believed that the truth was out there. He subscribed to the journal Flying Saucer Review, studied military reports about the phenomena, and collected a vast library of UFO books. He even founded a secret Royal UFO Spotters Club and ordered his equerry to investigate UFO sightings. However, he remained nervous about attracting ridicule for his crank hobby. Nick Pope, head of Ministry Defence's UFO project, told the Daily Star in 2016 that Prince Philip was absolutely fascinated with extraterrestrial activity. However, this royal interest in UFOs was extremely difficult for the Ministry of Defence because their policy was to downplay the true extent of their interest and involvement in UFOs. After the release of my previous film God vs. Aliens, which explores the spiritual impact that first contact would have on the world, I was contacted by a Canadian called Dan Costello, who claims to have worked on a top secret UK military project in 1975. It was called Serpico and was based at a military facility at Sandy Point in Nova Scotia, Canada. Costello claims to have been a child diver at the time and that a lot of the secret craft was stored in secret cylinders under the sea. Costello claims have been verified by an ex-US intelligence officer and 2 other colleagues who wish to remain anonymous. He states that Prince Charles, who was stationed at the time on the nearby HMS Endeavour, was drafted in to help fly an experimental hybrid craft, which used a form of electromagnetism as propulsion. Costello states that Charles was one of 3 pilots in a smaller craft, which had dual rotor blades and shaped like a flying disc. This smaller craft was then controlled by a larger craft, which had a giant magnet in it. Prince Charles and the other pilots then flew this craft to the NASA base at Langley in the USA. It sounds fantastical, and we have contacted Buckingham Palace for verification, but to date we have not received a response. This is Dan Costello's account.
My original attachment to the project in '75. So I met Max in my front yard at the age of basically 4.5.
Mm-hmm.
Then I met some of these engineers, like I met Sus, the Carthusian engineer, no arms, no legs guy. Then I met a bunch of the Royals, the Swires, Howden Humes, 10-minute walk from my house down the same street
Mm-hmm.
when they were building the steam turbine. Then I'm invited to join the project as a commercial diver, child diver, because they need me. They said that they needed me because the projects were being attacked and they weren't sure what needed to be achieved in terms of the risk factor.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these turbine sites they described to me as triple secret, which I'm told is never possible under any conditions. But I was 4.5. What are they going to explain it to me in ways I could understand?
Mm.
So one of the projects was a Sikorsky research site, which was a depot that I believe was at the header of LeBlanc's Pier. Now, I've compared notes with my classmate from down there a couple of weeks ago, and he recalls the site. In fact, he met a World War II veteran who told them about that site.
Mm.
It was what I would call a caisson pressurized pier, which you would normally see under a major ridge works, up to 150 feet deep, pressurized and designed to be dry, attached to the serviceways, which, like I say, they began in the 1700s. They'd updated to the 40s. And so it had pressurized docking systems inside. It had what you would call a key lock entry, which you might see on something like the Great Lakes lock systems, which would take a lighter from the water surface to the bottom of the caisson pier with whatever armaments were on board that lighter to load or unload from an Admiralty-rated ship.
Okay.
So that site had been updated from 65 to 69, I believe, under the Apollo mission science projects. This is what Prince Philip was overseeing on the site with very few details or documents to prove that. We're just learning more and more about what Prince Philip was up to in those years. He was forming the Royal Academy of Engineering at the time. And so some of their partners, this was described to me as a Sikorsky project prototype. I met the engineer, excuse me, who was originally coming from Texas. I met him coming with his family on the Sandy Point Road. I cannot recall his name. His nickname was Tex. And he brought his wife. His wife was running a flower shop downtown Shelburne. And then he brought his children with him. He had a daughter who was a bit older than me and a son who was just a little bit younger than me. And with him, he had brought 2 of these Studebaker cars that he was restoring. So part of his above ground cover story was he was working at the local woodworkers, which was adjacent to the Shelburne flower shop that his wife was running. And he was restoring those 2 cars. Below ground, he was a flight test engineer for Sikorsky. And he was part of the original Sikorsky engineering crew that was meant to fly this thing out of there.
Okay, yeah.
So this thing was in a very large designed compartment machine shop and or test bed facility that perhaps was 150 feet below the water surface at the water line, like I say, along the Sandy Point Road.
So it's stored underwater.
And it was flooded by the vandals who were attacking the site inadvertently. Between when I was there with the engineers, it was dry and it was accessible from the serviceway. And then the time that we went for the dive mission, it took 2 45-minute dive stops ascending back so that we wouldn't get the bends. This was Admiralty Experimental Diving Unit and their equipment. We had Admiralty issued, I had a custom fitted Admiralty issued dive suit for this equipment. We had interfacing comms inside the helmets. And at the bottom of the station, the lights were still on as I'd last seen it, but the thing had been flooded up to the water line. And part of my training at the time, they called it, quote unquote, like to avoid the trauma of the loss of life, as part of the recovery dive crew, they were calling it deference therapy. It wasn't hypnotism. It was sort of like a practical application of what the steps of the mission were going to be, what I was going to encounter, and how I would sort of set aside the traumatic events of seeing bodies in the water and so on. So I was trained not to notice the bodies in the water there. The serviceway itself was still lit, and it was filled with sharks and large manta rays and a lot of sand. A lot come in through the filtering system. Whoever attacked us was organized. They were associates of Serbian communists and associates of some terrorist groups that were coming back and forth to Canada through the Greenpeace boats. They were coming and going through embargoes in Sweden and elsewhere. All of those folks, I didn't know all those folks, but they were coming and going with high-profile Democrats and liberals. They were attached to some of the royals. They were what would you call activists without a cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they knew there was something of value there. So they somehow managed to flood the site out while the Sikorsky engineers were below.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to do divers recovery there of different keys for different caisson locks.
Mm-hmm.
And part of my job, I had the ancient, probably close to 100 engineer on my back, who's telling me where to put my hands and feet and what to do and what to turn and so on. He knew all the ins and outs of these sites. So I was his arms and legs, like his little beaker, from Battlestar Galactica. Like I was just strong enough to carry him. He was just small enough for me to carry. And so fitting that, that equipment was layered with a kind of almost like a stealth covering, not like a drop cloth, but it was layered to protect it from the elements. It was meant to be submergible in the ocean, seawater, and it was meant to be recovered. And I never really got a good look at it until the night of the, like I say, I think it was October 27th or 28th, 1975, seeing it being flight tested out of there. Prince Charles was part of the flight crew because in a pinch, they didn't have any more Sikorsky engineers that they could send in time. He was on the site and he had some of the analysis. He knew what the risks were. His pilot training team were there. He was never the primary pilot, as I recall. He was always the secondary pilot and or the navigator on all of his flight crews. Like you'd see him in the front cockpit, but he'd be the secondary in command. Like he'd be the commander, but with the least number of hours.
Yeah. Okay.
So what I recall about the equipment, I've done some analysis thanks to your probing. What I believe it could have been, might have been a variation on some of the landing simulation modules for some of the moon-based landing lunar modules.
Okay.
No confirmation on that. But the structurals of the thing were small enough that I suspect that's what it may have been. I did some analysis on the ion propulsion capacities of the Americans during the Apollo missions and find that the possibility that the ion propulsion unit may have been built into the substructure of this, and it may not have passed the flight tests necessary to go to the moon, but it may still have been there on site and they didn't really know what to do with it. A lot of the structurals there may have been parts and pieces brought back by Eric Bowater during World War II. A lot of the equipment that they could bring back would have been during the Commonwealth pilot training program, where they had Royal Admiralty was reserving a lot of the parts and pieces they could restore, recover, or reuse from crashed or damaged airplanes from the front lines.
So how was this vehicle powered?
Well, what I saw was it was like a dual enmeshed helicopter rotor. And the first time that I saw it was down on the waterfront along Adamant Street. And it was during the daylight hours. And I thought it was a helicopter, but it was silent. And I had seen helicopters come and go there. None of them had been silent. And then it was piloted by 3 pilots in 3 very characteristic domes. They were glass domes that may have been refitted over original cabinets that were unfinished and or unsuitable to flight. Might have been part of a simulator program. But the whole thing needed to be recovered, returned to Langley. That was the mission, was return this thing to Langley in one piece. And so the night of October 27th, 28th, I and the engineer on my back had already been into a turbine facility below the waterline where we had been attacked by divers who had fired a Gauss harpoon. I was wearing a metal suit that was supposed to defer the electrical risk of going into this turbine while it was flooded. I had the process by which, without reading and writing, I had taken the process testing to do all the switches and shut all the turbine fittings. We had a set of Heiko keys that would have been the earliest electronic keys on any of these controlled dive unit cabinet. Basically looked like a toaster oven, and you'd push the key, which was the size of a toothpaste or toothbrush holder, into the unit, and then get a green light to get through. They had peripheral defensive systems in this electric array that had to be, we had to get through to shut down, because all of this stuff was ready to fire if people messed with it too often. And this was the risk, that this stuff would start firing, and this would destroy a lot of the waterfront, a lot of the people, and possibly cause an electrical distortion event that no one could shut down. And it was interlinked across 3 counties of these depots. and which would have caused a lot of trouble for a lot of the electrical systems across the southern part of Nova Scotia. And it would have taken a few minutes, and then it would have been impossible to recover the system, and a mass death event would occur. And then this Sikorsky unit was right in the middle of the extraction point and entry point to all those turbine systems. Right. So we got our hearts stopped and restarted at the waterfront, at the water's edge. Then we were sent back in there were a bunch of these terrorists that were another kidnapping attempt on some of the associates of the Royals that were on the site. Mm-hmm. And then that evening, that particular engineer died, saving my life. I'm getting knocked out in the street. Mm-hmm. And then as I recover, I'm in my parents' house, and my parents are being taken away by the King's Own commando force to a secure location, mm-hmm. while this equipment is being flown up from the waterfront along the semaphore line at what would be described as very low elevation. Right. And it corresponds to what the computer-controlled assist on some of those lunar modules would have been, right. The earliest electronic systems. And so this thing was flying with a dual rotor, mm-hmm. that was slightly angled, sort of like some of the models that I showed you, not mm-hmm. quite the same. And I could tell by looking through, I could see that they were wearing the same helmets and metal suit that I'd already tested as a diver in previous weeks and months. Yeah. So I knew that they were our side. I knew that that was armor that had been designed and tested by the Hunt family that I knew there. And that was in the backyard of my house as they're carrying up the semaphore line. What I noticed was that this thing could cantilever at 25-degree angle without the helicopter rotors going. And this is when I was seeing this ionic blue flame coming from the nether region of the craft. Wow. And this was carrying up along the semaphore line where there were tunnels and other situations. There might have been some enemy along those tunnels, mm-hmm. and they might have been using the burner to turn them into glass, basically. The second rotary craft, it was massive. Like, it was way bigger than a West Hall, but it looked something like a West Hall. Mm-hmm. And it may have been a Howard Hughes iteration of one of the largest carrying load craft, because I wonder how they powered this particular prototype. They may have needed to take along extra fuel for whatever it was it did, and the secondary craft may have not only been assisting in its navigation, but also assisting in its fuel delivery systems. Might have had to land portions of the period on its way to Langley to take more fuel, because it might have been designed only to travel for short distances from the lunar orbit to the moon's surface. So this secondary craft was described to me as having a large magnet in the nose, and I remember it being it was 2 stories tall, the nose of this secondary craft. And I couldn't see the operators. I could see the flight deck, but I couldn't see inside. There was nothing lit in the flight deck to see who was in there. And like I say, it might have been one of the iterations Howard Hughes had made, because in later years, Hughes's Glomar Explorer was getting servicing in the port from 77 to 79. And this same German family, Armour family, was assisting in redesign of some of its drill bits, because they had skills and experience in designing diamond drill bits for industrial capacity. They had a range of skills in that family that they had assistance from Siemens AG and others. And like I say, there were still depots there from the days of English Cable and Wireless. Like, they had associates that went back that far. So that equipment being what it was, who else would have recalled the flight of this equipment? Because
just go back. You said this secondary craft. You told me there was control in the direction of the first craft that Charles was in. Was that right?
Yeah, well, part of what they did was they followed up with me before they took the flight of what they expected in terms of ground. Like, there was a risk of ground electrocution with this equipment.
Oh, right, okay.
And that they had previously had an electrical event there in 1903, quite close to my house, which was where they were sighted it was an enclosed Faraday cage and industrial turbine that had an accident prior to this time. The risk was that the carrying capacity of all the metal in all the serviceways would basically electrocute the environment of this equipment, the operators, and anybody within a 3 counties radius. Okay. So I wasn't a physicist, but they did have physicists that were assisting on the design of some of this. Like I say, it was an electrical shielding body armor that was described to me as being shark-proof, as well as it would defer the electrical field of this equipment. something like a Faraday cage, I think, in effect,
Yeah.
for the body.
Sure.
And so the magnet that was in the second rotary craft, well, what it was described to me, they had showed me videos from the days of what they called the Canada lens. And this is where I might have seen something they described as a UAP.
Right.
This was a video that they had of a very high resonance imaging camera system that could it could focus on what was going on at the orbital range of some of these nuclear flight tests for some of their missiles of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And they were saying that this project was somehow related to that. Some of the metal work and some of the glass work that was being done on the site was related to the Canada Lens projects. Ernst Liszt still had an office there. Lockheed Martin was still doing contracts with him through that. So there was some imaging and camera work as well as telescopic glass. So related to the project and the craft, I remember Charles and others were asking me about what did I think was the safe distance from the ground to carry this thing out of there without triggering ground effect, which was what they were asking me about. And during the original electrical event, the ground effect had been minimal on people around this event from about 5 feet to the ground. Like people who were trying to escape the electrical forces at the time were crawling away below whatever was taking place at the ground level. So they were trying to slip this thing out without triggering any of these risk factors that they knew already existed there. And I think Charles saved all of our lives that night.
All right.
Basically, his team did. And then when my parents came back the next day, they had really no memory of what had taken place that night.
Okay.
There was also, and I've looked at the meteorological event, there was a sort of a mini hurricane that took place the same night.
Was that related?
Well, this is what I'm not sure about, because when I woke up the next day, my dad arrived to the house and he said that was quite a hurricane. But then I was assigned to the divers unit. They still had a Canadian reservist, may still be living, who I was assisting along the serviceway in the road in front of our house. Whatever this event had been, knocked every one of the manhole covers off the street line all the way down to the port. So we were back in those serviceways. Everything inside there was charred, but it may have been charred from 1903. We were going where I was going with him. All of the turbine heads of all the original systems from the stealth works that had been there from World War II were fried out beyond capacity.
Right.
And these had all been functioning up until the day before.
Okay.
So a lot of those structurals were coming down anyway because they were formaldehyde, insulation risk, and so on. It was.
So why didn't
below ground?
So why didn't your father remember what happened?
This is what I wonder. And so I wonder about the magnet itself, if it was powerful enough to reformat short-term memories. Because what I recall is I came from this event to my house so quickly, I still had the metal suit on all that night. I still had the metal suit on when I went to assist the diver the next morning. And this was just peripheral to my house, all these systems that had been seemingly seared into, transformed from metal into carbon. And so that was sort of the transit of this equipment out of the station, out of the research station, along the semaphore line there, which was peripheral. And my father worked there above ground in the school for boys. And it was originally a Royal Navy turbine test site up until 1948. Right. It had been built and turnkey designed, similar to, if you see the architecturals around Holton Heath, Admiralty Materials Research Group. And then a lot of these Admiralty offices were amalgamated in 1977. So a lot of this stuff was being shut down in UK as well. And would have been things that had been under research since World War II with fellows like Roxby, Cox, Barron, and Norton, who I recall, because who forgets a guy's name, Roxby? I couldn't forget this guy's name. He was coming and going with an engineering team inside the office units around my dad's offices. They still had a skiff inside the administrative portion of my dad's office from the 1940s, maybe one of the first ones. And one of the guys in Dad's office had a key to a communications line, which is where I would go to communicate to Whitehall. They had it was a short wave or it was a long wave radio, and it was under key lock, and it was in my dad's admin office, and he didn't even know about that. Wow. So parts of the hallways around him were being transformed from former research turbine unit, even up to 1977, and he'd never seen inside some of those because he wouldn't have had the key for them.
Mm.
And so those sites were handed back over to, and they were transformed into regular offices by 77.
What was the name of this project anyway?
Well, what they told me it was called that I was in, they might have just been joshing me just to give me something to go on. We used to watch movies. They had movie nights at the school, and one of the movies that was popular at the time was Serpico.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
This is what they called it to me. They told me it was Operation Serpico because a bunch of these royals and their kids would sneak into the movie after the lights went out.
Hmm.
And they'd be there if the yacht was in harbor, or like I say, the Britannia would show up once in a while to pick up and drop off, and they wouldn't stay very long.
Hmm.
But Dannebrog was stuck in the Camel Laird dock from 77 to 79 because there'd been attacks on the dock by some of these terrorists, and it had to be refitted. We did a lot of glass work for Dannebrog while it was in there. And then the Norge may have been in under the waterfront during those years. It may have been there since World War II. I can remember King Olaf being a very personable fellow, as well as his son. I knew Harold. The closest of the royals' kids to me that I felt the most heartfelt affection for was Prince Haakon and Princess Martha Louise, and these two were inseparable when they would come. There would always be security, but they always had the chance to roam and play with me. I always enjoyed their company.
That's nice.
We were around the same age.
Just going back, sorry, going back to the craft. You said it had some sort of dual rotor thing.
Yeah.
Was it technology that was able to go submersible as well? And then,
well, this is what I wonder, because when I look at that book by Hansen, they described what they called the hydrodynamics department of NASA being shut down during the Apollo projects. That there was hydrodynamics turbine research being done there is certain. The sites of the hydro turbines that I saw, that I wasn't allowed to enter or exit, I was allowed to see the peripherals, and they were 5 stories tall and 5 stories wide. Now, what they were doing in there in terms of AC/DC transfer research, they may have been using what they call the mercury capacitors that were used prior to World War I. There were a lot of these glass speaker enclosed mercury driven. It transfers AC to DC, and it has a blue glow on these things. They're ancient technology. The turbine itself, like I said, I saw a lot of the serviceways around and about the ports of Shag Harbor, but not in it. Like Barrington Harbor is not far from Shag Harbor, and that's on the western edges of Shelburne's approaches. And like I say, there were sections over there from World War I controlled by a fellow named J.W. Flavel of Toronto. And this had been a British materials research board that had installed across Canada. It was quite heavily concentrated around Shelburne and those 2 or 3 counties that I recall. What they called, it was Imperial Munitions Board. And because the Quebecois were taking the side of the Kaiser during World War I, Canadian factories weren't legally allowed to produce munitions. So they had to set this up wherever they could find a space. And the spaces they were finding were like some of these old East India Company sites from the 1700s. And a lot of them were still functionally approachable around that port system. They would have been original barrel drop, like I say, for armaments and for shore party air, land, and sea materials. And so the equipment that they were testing there might very well have had some hydrological propulsion assist. What I recall on the ground during the flight of this equipment out was that what showed up in front of the house was, it looked like an armored personnel carrier, and it was draft fitted for submersible. It had a periscope on top, and it had a propulsion unit on the back. It had large nubby tires. It might have been only used in some of the serviceways when they were flooded, or it could have been able to enter and exit the harbor front. There were sections along the harbor front that were stage-driven, chain-driven dollies that would drop to the harbor bottom and then be able to be turbine tracked back up. Those were from the late 1800s. They were still functional. Those sections were attached to 1920s era Simon submarine era pressurized hatch entry exit systems for 2 to 3 person Simon submarine. They were some of the earliest commercial submarines that the U.S. Navy and the British Navy had worked with. There was still one of those. We recovered one of those in 76 below some of the serviceways. So the potential is there for this. what my friend from Sandy Point that I reconnected with from mentions that he had done some diving training around the harbor in the late 80s, early 90s, and that he had encountered some of these submersible tunnels and channelways around Government Point, because during the 1950s they had the sonar, that they called the SOSUS project, Project Caesar, which had come in from the United States and installed like a full hydrophone listening station for Russian submarines. Okay. Right. So this was all operating during 67. Right. So there were descriptions that there were at least 2 craft visibly seen moving about the harbor bottom in Shag Harbor. So it could have been this propulsion test unit from Sikorsky.
So this is the Shag Harbor UFO incident that people are talking about.
Yeah, peripheral to the site and not far from, and sort of integrating around it, not directly in Shag Harbor, but my having been in serviceways around Barrington Harbor, around Port Latour, not far from Shag Harbor, which leads me to suspect that they had a lot of this Royal Navy equipment coming and going through those decades.
So this could have been a Royal Navy prototype from NASA.
Exactly.
From what we have learned from our investigations, King Charles has a strong interest in UFOs. We have even found out that he allegedly attended a UFO conference back in 2009. He's also corresponded with UFO authors and researchers and has a keen interest in uncovering the mystery surrounding crop circles. But what can King Charles do to help the disclosure process both here in the UK and in the United States? I catch up with Nick Pope, who used to run the UK's UFO desk for the Ministry of Defence. Is there anything, say, King Charles was interested in, was kind of looking at the aspects of if disclosure was made or first contacts and his role as head of state, head of the Church of England, what could he do to help his followers, subjects?
Well, I think a couple of things. Firstly, talk behind the scenes clearly to leadership figures in the United States, whether it's the president or whether it's senior government, military, and intelligence community personnel. The king always has a sort of direct access hotline to the top people when he needs it or wants it, which is as you would expect it to be. So here is somebody who could lift up the phone and say, "Look here, what's going on in the United States? I've followed the story with interest about the NASA report, the reports from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the congressional hearings, the multiple UFO-related provisions in the defense bill. I want a full classified briefing," and I'm sure he would get one. But the other thing that he could do, which might be of more practical benefit in the United Kingdom, because we don't need to kickstart this in the US, it's already started. So what we really need to do is get this going in the UK, and one way to do that would be to get Parliament engaged on this and to get the sort of hearing in Parliament that we've seen in the US. And now the way to do that would be to get members of Parliament and peers to raise this by means of parliamentary questions, but also getting the Defence Committee to hold a hearing and essentially holding the Ministry of Defence to account. Now, not many people can do that, but I guarantee the King can. And if it had to be done by the sort of established route of maybe saying to the Secretary of State for Defence, "Look, I want you to do something," or a little bit more subversive, essentially inspiring some backbench MPs to raise this in sufficient numbers. I mean, how this all got started in the US was a small number of congressional representatives here and there started asking some questions. "Hey, I've read in the New York Times that despite denying you had a program, that you had a program, and you've got some US Navy videos. Well, I want to know what's going on." And it built and built, And so the same can happen in the UK, but it starts with a single MP or peer, and then a second, and then a third. And one person who could absolutely start that process is, of course, His Majesty the King.
Brilliant. Okay, let's hope he does. I mean, that's interesting what he said about getting MPs. Why aren't they, leveling questions in Parliament about it? Is there more stigma over here still regarding UFOs that an MP wouldn't want to jeopardise his or her career by talking about such woo-woo stuff? Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes, but there's only stigma until there isn't. And somebody has to go first. And yes, it's a big, brave first step. And there's always the fear of ridicule. And you don't want to be the politician associated with flying saucers if that's the way it's spun. But look, politicians can be very astute at times. And it's very easy, I think, particularly if you've got royal support, either overt or covert, but it's very easy to frame your interest in this, if you're a parliamentarian, as an interest stemming from commitment to open government, concerns about defense and national security, or concerns about flight safety. And it's no surprise, or it shouldn't be, that that's exactly how politicians handled it in the US. They said, look, I'm coming to this because I'm concerned that there are things in our airspace performing speeds, maneuvers, and accelerations that we can't match. And I want to know, and I'm sure the aerospace community wants to know, and the aviation community, what's going on. That's a perfectly legitimate interest to have. In fact, it would be bizarre if you weren't interested and concerned, for example, about flight safety in a situation where we've got pilots and radar operators speaking out about this. So there are ways to do it, and there are ways of easing yourself into the subject through this framing it in terms of defense, national security, and flight safety. And by the way, I should pay tribute to Lord Black, who is perhaps one of the few parliamentarians who has asked questions about this on and off over the last 3 or 4 years. But it probably needs someone in the Commons as well as the Lords, and it probably needs 2 or 3 of them to go at once till you begin to build up a little bit of critical mass.
Yeah. Maybe we should be writing to our MPs. I think I will do that. Write to our MP and,
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's got to be done the right way. It's not what you can't just do is say, I want the government to take this seriously, because all that happens is the Ministry of Defense, which stopped investigating, so they say, at the end of 2009, and therefore has no real corporate memory on this, they'll just send a boilerplate reply saying, well, we looked at this for decades, never found anything of any defense significance in terms of a threat. We monitor the air defense region 24/7 through all the standard means like radar, and we're confident in all our processes. Well, that gives them an easy out. So that can't be the question or the concern. The question must be something like, given that the United States, which has conducted a more recent and thorough assessment of this than the United Kingdom, has declared this to be a national security threat, will the UK now hold a defense committee hearing on this subject? So it must be very specifically framed in terms of the Americans have just looked at this and engaged. It's no good the UK falling back on just historical actions, which are well out of date and out of step with the assessment of the dominant power in NATO. If the lead power in NATO says we've done a much more recent assessment than anyone else, more thorough, and we say we should be looking at this, then other countries should be doing so. And there are hints, of course, that through the mechanism of the Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing alliance between the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, there are some indications that this is now happening, but all that's behind the scenes. We need something a little bit more open, and we need Parliament to step up.
Other people have seen. I mean, I went and interviewed Randall Jones Pugh. He was the Bufora investigator. He was a vet by profession, and I can relive these things. I'm in the house with him, and we were talking about it, and he said, "John, are you religious?" I said, "Well, I'm a Christian." He said, no, that's not what I meant. He said, "Do you take, are you Catholic, or do you go to church, and etc." I said, "Well, not really." And so he said, "Well, I admire you for what you're doing." He said, "But," he said, "don't bother." He said, "Because this is demonic. This is what this is all about, demonic. UFOs are demonic." And he told me about 2 sightings he'd had, and then, then I left. But he's not the only one. I've met other people that have got involved, and then one of them was the Reverend Paul Inglesby. He was a mate of Lord Hill Norton's. Back in the 90s, they bought something out, UFO Concern, I think it was called, and they wanted to raise the interest. They wanted some sort of disclosure. Well, it wasn't going to go anywhere at all. But the Reverend Paul Ingleby thought that it was demonic, so split it away from the UFO. But as we said before, come on, UFO and paranormal, surely. At times they interact, so that indicates the possibility that we're talking about the same phenomena. And it's like somebody once said to me, "Well, hang on, if you see a light in the sky, it's UFO. If you see a light cross disclosure, I can't." It always fuels the excitement, the imagination. It fuels the curiosity. It makes people think that we're getting closer. But in reality, we haven't got a clue. We haven't got a clue, have we? We just don't know.